In April of 2018, an employee at a Starbucks in Philadelphia called the police on two black men for loitering when they were actually waiting on a friend before placing their order. In response to this incident, people expressed the need for Starbucks employees to undergo implicit bias training because they believed that implicit bias motivated the employee's behavior. This reflects a general trend in which people are attributing instances of discrimination to implicit bias. Perhaps you have even heard this term while reading the news or watching TV. But in case this term is new to you, implicit biases are associations between categories, such as women and family versus men and careers, or Black Americans and criminal, but white Americans and law-abiding. Consider your thoughts as an iceberg, where the part above the water represents your conscious thoughts and contains any explicit biases. These are attitudes and beliefs that you might say out loud or report on a survey. The part below the water contains your unconscious thoughts, like implicit biases. Research on implicit biases has helped demonstrate the subtle yet pernicious ways that discrimination can persist. However, my dissertation research has uncovered a downside to attributing discrimination to implicit bias. Across several studies, I have found that when an act of discrimination, such as police officers wrongfully arresting or using force against Black Americans, is attributed to implicit bias, people hold the perpetrator less accountable than when that very same act is attributed to explicit bias, shown here by the blue and green bars. Upon first glance, this seems to fit with our moral and legal frameworks. After all, we hold people less accountable for unintentional behaviors compared to intentional ones. But just because a bias is unconscious doesn't mean a behavior is unintentional. Police officers are aware of who they decide to arrest or use force against. Nonetheless, suggesting implicit bias played a role shapes perceptions of accountability. This presents a problem because it's necessary to hold people accountable in order to create lasting change. As exemplified by the headline here, implicit bias is becoming an increasingly popular explanation for persistent discrimination. However, it's nearly impossible outside the lab to know retroactively whether or not implicit bias was the actual cause of the behavior. Perhaps it is tempting to use this term to explain persistent discrimination because it feels like a safe way to explain the problem, akin to racism without racists. Unfortunately, racism comes in many forms, and in order to make true progress, we must recognize and address the complex forms, from implicit to explicit to individual and systemic. As the nation continues to reckon with persistent discrimination, it is necessary to be thoughtful about when and why we attribute instances of discrimination to implicit bias in order to hold people accountable and build a more equitable society.